Hey there, YouTube, and welcome to a pretty different video, as should be immediately obvious. So I've been trying to experiment with some new content formats recently, and part of that involves using a webcam. This was also recorded live on Twitch, so if you want to check out my stream, I will post it down in the description. But yeah, let me know what you think of the new format, and hopefully you enjoy. Here are my top 5 favorite games of 2021. All right, so number 5, Half-Life Alyx. Half-Life Alyx is the best VR game ever by like a lot. I do not think VR has been worth it for me, which is a really weird way to start the praise for this game. It's really expensive. You need a lot of physical space in your place to like be able to set it up. And ideally, in my opinion, the only like VR headset worth getting is the Index because of the higher field of vision, frame rate, and controllers that have sensory inputs for your individual fingers. And Half-Life Alyx obviously was built for the Index. Since it's Valve's game and Valve's console, and it actually feels like a real VR game. Everything else, or the majority of VR content and or games, has felt like a series of tech demos or like cool ideas or gimmicks, or like here's like a weird experience where you don't actually do that much and it's like not really a game. And like some of those are pretty fun. Like Beat Saber, for example, is kind of fun and like is pretty close to I think what I would consider a game. But it's just like very different than like an actual narrative experience with like a set of mechanics. It's just a very different thing. You know what I mean? Like I think Alyx is basically the first game on VR where I feel like I've actually experienced a game. And I think the reason it works so well relative to other like tech demos or different games is immersion. The graphical fidelity, so in other words, the high frame rate combined with like realistic graphics that runs well, combined just with like solid underlying gameplay mechanics, comes together really well. Another example is the physics engine. So what you probably saw just there is that the gameplay is you have sort of a force pull, like you can flick objects to grab them to you. Not only does that feel amazing to play in terms of like mechanical mastery over the world and just like feeling like a badass, the physics work really well. So I don't know if actually, let me just pull it up. So this was like a big deal when this video was released, which is so funny. They added a shader to like water or like fluid objects, and it actually is just like so cool. So like look at how good that looks. And it's like this is just an example of like a subtle thing like that I feel like most people won't ever notice or care about. But like in VR, that type of like graphical fidelity or physics engine simulation, like these things matter so much more to immersion. And I think like that example of just like, look at the fucking bubbles in the water. You know what I mean? Like that type of detail is required, I think, to have a truly immersive game in VR. And so this is, I think, why Alyx is so far ahead of every other game. And arguably, it's worth buying VR for. Arguably. It is essentially, I think, the system seller of VR. The problem is it's literally the only thing worth playing, in my opinion. Like, you can, if you get it, like I said, like, there's Beat Saber and other, like, kind of gimmicky games. But to be honest, nothing on VR has even remotely impressed me outside of Half-Life Alyx. And again, that comes down to, at the end of the day, immersion and really good game feel. Like, the idea of being able to force pull objects and stuff like that. And search the environment for like hidden collectibles, and it works really well. And I think physics are the biggest reason, because everything is physics based, right? Tossing a grenade, grabbing a gun, shooting an enemy, picking up an enemy that you've killed, and like fucking around with them, like all that type of stuff. It goes so far to like making the game feel immersive and or just like really good to play. Like that's the type of stuff that I think you need in a VR game in order to like make it feel like a real space, whereas everything else is just sort of like tech demo-esque. So I guess the other thing that I'll just mention about Half-Life Alyx is it's just really well paced. Like I don't know if anyone watching has played any of the other Half-Life games, but one of the things I did last year was go through all of the Half-Life series, and I think one of the standout things about the series is just how well paced it is, the diversity of content across all of the levels. I think Alyx also encapsulates a lot of that. So that's not just necessarily mechanical diversity of content, but also just in terms of like atmosphere, like having a more like a horror level, and then more of like a light-hearted level, or like a vehicle level, or like whatever it is, right? Like the pacing in these games is really well done. So yeah, I think that's Half-Life Alex. The TLDR is it's basically the first game that has made VR worth it, and it really is a great game. It's hard to compare it to like a really good traditional game like The Witcher 3 or Red Dead 2 or something like that, because it's like probably of equal quality, but the fact that it's in VR is like really a different feel. You know, it's just not the same. It's so hard to compare one to one. So it's like, is it better or worse than any of those games? Like, probably worse, because it's still like, you know, VR has limitations and it still feels like people are trying to figure out what it can be. But like, it's also, its uniqueness is something that matters a lot as well in terms of like why you should play it. So there's my super rambly thoughts on Half-Life Alyx. There's number 5, my 5th favorite game I played last year. Number 4. It's going to be weird to talk about. Everhood. Everhood is fucking weird. God, where to even begin? It's basically like Undertale on drugs, and Undertale is already like a trippy experience. Specifically LSD, I would say, is a good description for Everhood. It is a music/rhythm-based game. Really beautiful. The way that they use lighting in terms of the like visual presentation is phenomenal, and particularly the lack of light. It has almost this like cool like neon-esque like nightclub visual style, and it's really cool, especially in the boss fights. Like I vibe with that aesthetic pretty hard. Mechanically, it's pretty simple. Like you just essentially dodge light beams, but I enjoyed the heck out of this game. It has all of the weirdness that you would expect from Undertale in terms of like a writing perspective, but I don't think it's as charming in terms of the writing quality. But the gameplay is pretty cool, and it's someone who likes rhythm games a lot, likes music-based games. This one is a pretty standout experience. It's not that long too. I think it's like maybe 15 hours at max. Like I said, as someone who just loves rhythm games in general, it's like a really cool experience. Number 3, Death's Door. So I think one of the things that'll be immediately obvious about this is the visual style. It's a beautiful game. It's also made by the developers of Titan Souls, if you're familiar with that game. It was a sort of a boss rush style game. But I think Death's Door is basically an improvement in every way. So in terms of like what the game actually is, it is a Zelda/Souls-like experience. I would say more Zelda than Souls specifically. Like it's not that hard or I mean, yeah, it's just not that hard. But it is a really well done indie game that's a very compact experience. And to be honest, I think this game encapsulates a lot of just why I like indie games in general. Is they have a really cool visual style. They had a really clear focus of what they wanted to achieve out of the game, and there's zero bloat. And a lot of my problems with AAA games is I feel like they go through this process of trying to essentially create extra stuff just to validate their cost, and like just to basically prove that they're like worth their time, because look at how much content we have. But a lot of those systems end up feeling like bloat. And I feel like Death's Door is just a really good example of an indie game just doing what indie games do. It's just like a very focused experience that's really polished, really well done, and it just feels really good to play and looks really, you know, it just looks really good. So yeah, I mean, I think like, you know, in terms of that pitch, like that should be a pretty clear understanding. Like, do you like Zelda-like games? If so, you should definitely check it out. If you like Dark Souls style games, like it's probably going to be a good time as well. The other thing that I'll just mention about it is that it has some pretty cool boss fights as well. Like obviously Titan Souls, their previous game, as I mentioned, was a boss rush type game. So all it had was boss fights. And so their mastery over creating compelling boss fights is like really cool. The game also has a good sense of humor. It's like got a ton of variety, both in terms of like puzzles and action sequences or enemy design. Obviously the environments too look like super varied, and I definitely think they are. So yeah, there's almost no way for me to criticize this game. I think if anything, the criticism is that like it's not the most memorable experience, or the highs are like not the highest thing in the world. Like it's consistently basically a 9 out of 10 experience, but it doesn't have that many like, oh my god, I've been blown away type moments. But like that almost feels unfair to criticize the game for that reason. Like because it's just so polished end to end. If the last 2 games have not been a good indicator of my preferences, we're just gonna keep continuing that theme to drive it home. Because my next favorite game that I played in 2021 was a game called The Pathless. Surprise, surprise, it's an indie game with a beautiful art style and a really focused experience. So this was created by the developers of Abzu, which for those who don't know is a really cool like experiential game similar to Journey. I don't think it ended up being as good as Journey, but it was still like a nice experience. And they managed to just take like the visual appeal of that game and just fucking knock it out of the water in this new game. And more importantly, it actually has actual gameplay. So the pitch in this game is it is essentially a open world exploration game. And that seems weird for an indie game, but essentially the like notable things is that the open world is pretty small. It took me about 11 hours to play in total, and that's 100%ing the world. And it's much more about, let's see. The way that I'll say this is that the game understands what makes an open world game good, which I think is not true of most open world games. And by that I mean they focused on making the movement the most compelling part of the game. So the entire presentation of the game is around the movement. So essentially you have a bow and arrow, and there's just targets littered all across the world. And if you shoot the target based on like timing, you don't actually have to aim at it, it just auto aims. If you do it based on the timing, you'll get a massive sprint and can like zoom through the world. And that means the act of playing the game and the act of exploring an open world is inherently compelling. And I feel like so many open world games don't understand that concept. They make the open world like all of the interesting things, or the design philosophy is like all of the interesting things are getting to these locations, and the process of getting there is almost never that compelling. And this game understands that the process is as equally important as the objectives or the things to explore. And so I give the game a lot of credit for that. I guess the other things that I'll just say, a good variety of content. Obviously, you know, the levels are pretty different. The bosses are pretty cool as well. It has like unique boss fights that are pretty cool. And the other thing that I'll say that is potentially one of the biggest compliments I can give to a game is that I couldn't put it down. So I ended up playing this game in full, 100% in one single playthrough. And like, I just think that's the biggest compliment you can give a game. So I thoroughly enjoyed it. It captures a lot of what I like in games. A really cool expressive art style, a really focused understanding of what makes the game fun to play, and a just really compact experience with, again, no bloat. Which brings me to number one, my favorite game of 2021, Deus Ex Mankind Divided. So let me start out by saying that this game is a buggy fucking piece of trash. It crashed so many times, and I had more technical problems with this game than fucking Cyberpunk. It was also filled with a bunch of deprecated features because the game is 5 years old, and their publisher, for some reason, added a bunch of weird one-time features that they just decided to stop supporting, meaning this game is actively missing accessory content, which is so fucking like crazy. Like, what the hell? This game also has super weird monetization, and it even included a day one purchasable DLC, which is such a horrible thing. I cannot express how anti-consumer that is. Now, despite all of that, it was my favorite game I played in 2021. Like, by a decent amount, too. It is, I think, easily the best immersive sim that I've ever played. So for those who don't know, the immersive sim genre focuses on trying to provide the player a lot of ways to interact with the world in at least like a somewhat realistic way. And by that, I mean that like a traditional game will give you a specific set of tools to solve problems. So in other words, an FPS will give you a gun and say, in order to get from A to B, in order to get to your goal, fucking shoot everything. It's an FPS. Other games will be like, all right, well, this is a narrative moment, so you have to go through the narrative storyline that we have laid out for you. You know, talk to this guy, do this quest, you know, complete these objectives. Like, you know, it's very much like this is the way to solve it, and here's the way to progress. Immersive sims are more about providing a bunch of tools simultaneously and a sort of a vague end objective, and providing multiple ways for that objective to be completed, which I think is really cool because it is something that only games can do. It is essentially all about player expression, right? Like, if you try to play an immersive sim in a way that you try to play other games, you will have a bad experience because that's just not the point. And as a completionist, immersive sims are really cool because I will often try to approach a problem, an objective, or a space from every single angle. So you can either approach a thing as a player, be like I'm a stealth guy, I'm going to do stealth things. I'm a hacker guy, I'm going to do hacking things. And you can get through the objectives just focusing on your one play style. But as the completionist, I get to experience all of the different options. I'm going to open every door, I'm going to go in every crawl space, I'm going to talk to every NPC. And so for me, that gives me a really well-rounded holistic appreciation of all of the different things that this game does to provide alternative pathways and tools for the player. So an example would be if like your goal is to like get into a base and let's just say like steal an item or something, right? Like there's bad guys and they have an item that you need. So option one would be to like hack into the door and like sneak your way around, or like hack a camera to shut it off, or like hack a locked window and then climb up to the second story and go in the window. Another option would be vents. So maybe there's a vent hidden behind a dumpster. So if you move the dumpster, you can go to a vent that'll lead you into the basement. You can work your way up from the basement. Maybe on the second floor there is a vent that leads up to the third floor. Maybe normally there's like some roof that you can climb on that only is as high as the second floor, but you can skip the first like 2 floors if you go find this vent and then get onto the third floor and maybe work your way down. If you've invested in strength points, you can be able to lift heavy objects, which will help you get up onto higher levels, or like move that dumpster to uncover the hidden vent. If you also have strength points, there are literally some breakable walls. So maybe you just fucking go full Kool-Aid man and punch your way through the wall. And like now you're suddenly in like you went through the back door of the building where there was literally no door and you made your own. Or maybe you've invested in leg strength so you can jump up directly onto the roof at the third store and like go in, you know, like a window ceiling or something like that. So those are examples of all of the way in just a physical sense you can explore the world. But on top of that, there's also a lot of narrative options, mostly derived from just being able to talk to players and inspect the environment. So there's a lot of missions designed around like, hey, I found this piece of like evidence earlier. I found this relevant clue for this mission, this relevant item. Now I'm going to bring that item's attention to an individual, and then I'll change the conversational options. Or maybe instead of just like trying to sneak my way in, I can talk to the front guard and, you know, use my charisma sort of points to persuade them to let me in. And maybe I just walk in scot-free and I don't even have to worry about sneaking in. Maybe the charisma options will work, but then like they want to trade, or has like, hey, I'll let you in here, I'll give you this item if you complete this side mission for me. And so there's a lot of like depth to solving one problem. And it basically means that if you just like one-shot linear the game or just like straight FPS it, you're not going to have a good time. But as someone who wants to appreciate all that a game offers, this game was essentially made for me. Now, the problem that I have with most immersive sims is that the pacing sucks. So, like, yes, you can do everything, but maybe that just sounds exhausting. And I think in practice, it really is, right? Was it actually rewarding to find that vent when you already had completed the objective? Like, probably not. But the game has a lot of systems designed to support that. So for example, you'll get like exploration experience and bonus points. Or if you go through the process of talking to everyone, the game will actually give you unique content specifically designed for dialogue that if you sneak in, you'll just totally miss. One of the things that, in fact, that trick specifically is one of the things the game uses most liberally, and I think is one of the most exciting and interesting pieces, is there were like multiple long side quests that are very easily missable, which some people may not like because they're like, oh, well, you know, that's stupid. Why would the game all add this like optional side content that like is kind of hard to get to? But it really isn't. It's just like if you talk to everyone and explore every like, you know, thing that they bring up, they're going to provide you with like unique content designed for that piece. And I think that a thing that a lot of immersive sims or RPGs in general miss is that they give you multiple tools to solve a problem, but they don't give you unique content for each tool to solve. So for example, in this game, if you hack a computer, and I think this is true of a lot of traditional RPGs, if you hack a computer, like you get to read their emails. You've unlocked new content by using your tools. That is often not the case of dialogue. So for example, by comparison, Fallout will give you charisma stats that will allow you to bypass the encounter. So for example, your objective will be like, get this warring gang near you to back down. So option 1 is just kill all of them, right? Or option 2 is have a charisma high enough where you've just convinced them through a single dialogue choice to just walk away. Now, by using the like more interesting, like non-traditional route of RPG mechanics, you've now essentially robbed yourself of content, because now like all of that gameplay where you shot them has gone out the window and you've just ended the mission super easily without having to do anything. Where this game takes the approach of like each path represents a unique content experience. And the fact that they've built out all of this additional content through the different systems, I think speaks to its strength as a game. The other thing that I will say around this game that works really well is that it gets rid of the traditional linear model, and it also doesn't go straight open world either. So in other words, the flow of the game is that there is a open world hub that is pretty small. It's like a small city that is dense as fuck. So for me to even do my first mission took me like 20 hours because I just spent so much time in this hub exploring everything. And you don't have to do that because you'll keep coming back to the hub throughout the game. And I will say, this is a minor spoiler, so skip ahead like, I don't know, 10 seconds. But the hub changes over the course of the game every time you leave and come back, which is also pretty cool. So it unlocks different areas and stuff like that, or progresses side quests in different ways. But essentially, to me, the way that they have solved the level design is one of the best ways of actually using an open world and linear stories. Because if this game was just truly linear, and the previous game in the series was, where it was just like mission after mission after mission with like some hub areas, but like hub areas were essentially treated as a mission. You didn't really come back to them. The problem with that is it's like, cool, you navigate a space and you're always moving forward, but it doesn't really give you that sense of like realism or immersion. Having a dedicated hub, it achieves the open world aspiration of having an immersive experience and like being able to transform a similar like environment. But it also like the way that it solves the open world problem, which is something I talk about in one of my other videos, is that a lot of open worlds are really large, but like really sparse for content, right? Like there's specific instances of content in specific locations. And similar to Pathless, it understands that that is like not getting the most out of open world design. So what the Pathless does is it makes the mechanics really interesting so that the active traversal to those sparse locations is really fun. But the way that Deus Ex Mankind Divided solves that problem is it just makes the areas like super dense with content. So every single building will have something unique. And it really does feel like that. Every single building will have a vent, will have a breakable wall, will have like a hidden backdoor entrance, will have a secret vault. We'll just have a way to engage with it where you're constantly being like, holy shit, this was handcrafted content. And by exploring it, by fucking around, I have been insanely rewarded as a player. And I feel like a lot of games miss that, right? It's like in most games, it would just be like, oh, cool, like there's going to be a mission in the sewers. And so this one area of the sewer will have like a really handcrafted specified area because we have a quest there. The game has every single inch of the hub world fully fleshed out, regardless of if there is actual content there. Now, oftentimes there is content that does end up appearing there, right? They use the space pretty effectively. If not in like one side quest, it'll be like in part 2 of a side quest or something like that. But like the world is so dense with content that like I rarely feel rewarded for exploring, and this game made me feel rewarded for exploring and engaging with all of its different systems. The other thing that I'll say on just like a totally separate note that works really well with this game, I find, is the story, because the story is fucking insane. The enemies are the Illuminati. They are the nemesis and or bad guys in this game. And the game has like a weird sort of like, I don't even know how you describe it, like James Bond-esque style, like secret, like society theme. And so not only is that present in the story, but also in the world, because there's like, oh, you got to hack into this base that's like has like, you know, a secret vault in it or something like that. Or like, you know, the base thing you operate out of within the hub area is like super well hidden and you have to have like a VIP access card. And it's like, it's cool things like, oh my God, like there was a wall safe behind the painting, or like you had to pull like this like statue's head or like twist it slightly and then it unlocks a secret compartment. It's like very like, you know, like spy fantasy. And like that's in spades in the world, and it's reflected in the story too, which is pretty cool. With like the whole Illuminati, and it works well because the main character is played very deadpan, so it has sort of like this contrast of like very goofy like like stakes or like context, but played very seriously, and so that contrast is like pretty entertaining. The other thing that I'll say about the story is the thematics that are at play. It's a very like superficial story in terms of the depth, and it's played like very obviously. It's not subtle at all. And that is essentially the idea of like racism as a discussion point or like a thematic. It's not traditional racism. It's like, you know, post-humanism / you know, near future racism, in the sense of like there's augmented humans that have like cybernetic arms or biotics essentially, and like people without them. So augs for augmented, or naturals for people who don't have any augmentations, and the societal sort of like dynamics at play between those two groups. The like short version is that essentially, right, like if you're a natural, if you're someone without augmentation, there's potentially pressure to get augmentations because you could be more efficient at your work. But there's also a fear around augmented people because like they have like superhuman arms, right? They could punch through walls and like pick up objects that are really heavy that commercially could be used to like move packages easier or something like that, but they're also potentially like borderline weapons. So there's natural tension that I think arises from that, and it's one of the main thematics of the story. And particularly the thing that I think the game does well, albeit heavy-handedly, is that it puts you at the center of the conversation in terms of like making many interactive ways for the player to be made aware of their augmented status, but also just through a lot of environmental details, like a la, BioShock, for example, right? So there's like a naturals and augmented separate entrances in the subway. Again, it's like not subtle at all, but like it works to reinforce this sort of like immersion. Or like, protests in the streets, people talking about being afraid of augs, newspapers talking about like the aug problem, or ads around augmented people. One of the main narrative storylines is the idea of there's like an augmented paradise being built so that augs can go there so they don't have to like face oppression. Just comments offhanded by bystanders talking about like the state of the world and stuff like that. As a player, you can be stopped by police and be like, hey, show me your papers because you're augmented, and so you need to have like extra clearance or like be accounted for. Obviously, trying to draw parallels to like Nazi Germany, or the idea of like ostracization of Jews and stuff like that. So I think like it's very heavy-handed, and I think it doesn't say a lot with the material, which is I think a criticism of it. But I appreciate the attention to detail and the immersion of trying to portray a world with that level of detail. It's something that I think like a lot of games will be like, hey, in this cutscene you'll experience this one thing, but it's not reflected in the environmental detail, environmental storytelling, or the world more generally, like outside of main missions. And I think this game does a good job at really trying to immerse the player in that type of just like every inch of this conflict is built in and seeped into the different aspects of the world design, the level design, in the narrative. So I think all of that is to say I really enjoyed the game despite its technical problems. It's such a shame that it has so many technical problems because like it would otherwise be like such a good game. And the game's been out for like 5 years, so I don't think it's going to get patched anytime soon. But yeah, if you're someone who's ever enjoyed an immersive sim, other immersive sims being like Prey or Dishonored, I think this game just kind of crushes those, to be honest, in terms of like what an immersive sim can be. Yeah, I mean, if you're someone who's just interested in like cyberpunk or post-humanism, or just like or someone who enjoys exploring worlds or dialogue-focused third-person type games with stealth elements, like this game just crushes it. I think it's a real gem that apparently got like pretty negative reception at release, even outside of all of the problems that I talked about with like day one DLC, or like other weird, just like a lot of weird systems in the game that like other games don't do. Like there's like ARG type elements, but even outside of all of those things, apparently got pretty poor reception. I think Deus Ex as a series has a lot of hardcore fans who have a lot of expectations, but as someone who hasn't played a lot of the games, like the only other Deus Ex I played was the one that released 10 years ago, Human Revolution, which I enjoyed, but it didn't stick with me as much as Mankind Divided did. So yeah, that was my favorite game I played in 2021. I think just sort of reflecting for a second, or just reflecting in general, I think this year was pretty bad for games, to be honest. I think people, like, this is a pretty good example of just a general feeling of disappointment around games, was just looking at the Game of the Year nominees. Yeah, so, like, here's the best games. Like, Deathloop, I don't think was very good. It Takes Two was good, and I think maybe even one Game of the Year. Metroid Dread, I don't think was good. Psychonauts 2 was good, but, like, not that good. Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, I haven't played but heard good things about. And Resident Evil Village, I think was fine. Like, these are all fine games, but I don't think any of these are as transformative as like God of War or something like that. So I think overall this year was pretty disappointing for games, it's weird to say that like this list does not like inspire me compared to previous years, despite the fact that I played more games this year than any other year. So I think that's reflective of potentially the year more broadly. But the last thing that I did want to cover real quick, just at the end here, was my DLC shout-out. So in other words, favorite DLC that I played this year. I couldn't decide on a single one, so I chose two, which is the Mass Effect 3 DLC known as Citadel, and the Outer Wilds Echoes of the Eye DLC. It felt like in the Citadel DLC, it was essentially like BioWare's writing team unleashed. It felt like in Mass Effect 3 in general, the writing had to be pretty constrained in order to create a satisfying ending to the game, which arguably some people think that they didn't do, but they had so much pressure to tie so much up in like a huge like narrative with emotional stakes and weight that it just felt like they couldn't really find their stride in the same way that they did with the Citadel DLC. It was a return to Mass Effect 2's character-focused writing, which I think is like a, something that I really enjoyed, Mass Effect 2 being my favorite game that I played in the trilogy. There was a lot of fan service in the game, and no, I don't mean the anime kind. I mean in just the sense of like, it was like, what if these characters did this thing together? It's like crazy over-the-top scenarios that is just really fun. Very like non-canon-esque, but like, honestly, it was just way more enjoyable to play. A lot of closure as well. It wrapped up a lot of the companion storylines in a really satisfying way. And in just in general, they had a lot of fun with it. It was a willingness to have fun, a willingness to engage with so much of the fucking like chaos. As for the second DLC shout out, Outer Wilds, Echoes of the Eye. If you haven't heard of Outer Wilds or haven't heard me talk about Outer Wilds, it was one of my favorite games that came out in 2020 or that I played in 2020. It's fucking phenomenal. It is such a refreshing game in terms of what it tries to do. It's an entirely physics-based game set in space with a series of planets made by students who I assume went full-time game dev at this point, but it was very much like the whole context for the base game was that it was essentially like a bunch of nerds who was like, what if we make a super realistic physics engine in terms of trying to program gravity and stuff like that? So when you're flying through space, like the actual pull of planets and like the different gravitational, pulls are like very realistically simulated. It's a roguelike that focuses on information rather than actual stats-based progression, which I think is a really novel concept that they nail really well because, it's more, for me, it's like much more up my alley rather than just grinding for stats run after run. It's more of like, cool, I have now gained information about this world permanently. And in that way, you can never really replay it. Because once you know everything, even if you start a new save, like you understand what happened, you know all of the relevant points, and it's a game that if you know what you're doing, you can beat in like, 1 or 2 runs. Like you can beat it in like 20 minutes. And I think that's just a really cool concept, is that the mastery of the gameplay is knowledge. As for the DLC itself, they tried a lot of new things. It's just really fucking cool. That has, I think, some of the most breathtaking level design in terms of, I don't want to spoil it, so I won't go into details, but in terms of like what they're able to do with the physics, it has incredible atmosphere, some really, really memorable, tense, shocking, and like, just really exciting moments in the game. The highs of this game are incredible. I'd say, or DLC in general is incredible. I'd say if there was one criticism, it'd be that the pacing is a little rough sometimes. It is ultimately kind of a puzzle-based game, and there was times similar to the base game where I got really stuck sometimes, especially near the end, because if you just can't put the pieces together of the contextual, of what they're trying to tell you contextually through the world, then you're just going to run into a bit of a pacing blocker. So I did end up having to look up a piece of it, which is a shame because, obviously it'd be way more fulfilling if you can figure out everything out on your own. And there was, similarly to the base game, there was like a moment or two where I had to look stuff up for the base game. But like 90% of it, I didn't have to. And so I think that's a credit to the good game design and trying to lead you around the world. So that's really my only criticism. Outer Wilds is just one of the most unique experiences you can get in gaming. And for that reason, it always will hold a special place in my heart and is an easy recommendation for anyone who is like me and likes novel experiences. And the DLC is just more of the same in the sense of like more new novel experiences, which is just really impressive, right? They could have easily just tried to like play it safe, and they did not. And I just give them so much credit. Like easily one of my favorite developers in terms of just the ambition that they have. So hope you enjoyed the video. Obviously, this was a pretty different experience. If it wasn't obvious by now, and I think I mentioned this at the beginning, this was all recorded on Twitch, so more live stream content. Probably won't be as like minute to minute compelling as a scripted piece, but we'll see how it goes. I'm going to edit it down in post. Hopefully I can make it a bit more snappy, and let me know what you think. Hopefully you enjoy the type of content. I'm definitely in the short term interested in doing more of this type of content with different topics. So we'll see how it goes. But if you made it this long, appreciate it immensely for watching, and let me know what you think in the comments.